Okay, so let's do the vertebrae now. And we're going to start with the vertebrae that is closest to the actual skull of the animal. So I talked about in the bovine and equine and porcine, actually caprine skulls, where we talked about the occipital bones and the occipital condyles, and that the occipital condyle is what articulates with the first vertebrae of the vertebral column. The first vertebrae that starts to articulate with the actual skull is called the cervical vertebrae. So the cervical vertebrae makes up the neck of the animal. The first vertebrae of the cervical is called the atlas, and it is going to articulate. Let me move this animal to the side for you so you can see this a little bit better. This allows the animal's head to go up and down in a no, I'm not doing that or going that place. So that's the atlas. The atlas is the cervical bone. Cervical bone is the neck vertebrae. And then we have the axis, and it articulates, and it allows the animal to shake its head. Wait. That was yes. My bad. This is no. So he's going, no, I'm not going that way. Yes, I will. I will go wherever the food is. Sorry about that, everybody. So between the atlas and the axis cervical vertebrae, you're going to have the animal that can shake its head no. Between the atlas and the occipital condyles, you'll have where the animal can shake his head yes. Now the rest of the vertebrae of the cervical component of the vertebral bones have more, and this is going to be a bovine one, very large. They're going to have more of a square shape until they get to the next set of vertebrae. Now looking at each vertebrae, you have very basic components that make up the vertebrae, okay? You have the vertebral body, okay? And then you'll have the transverse processes. So these are going to be the processes that come out at the side like a little airplane wing. And then you have the spinal process, and so this is what you see when you're palpating the animal, or if you got a skinny animal where you can actually see their entire somebody says I can see their spine or I can see their vertebrae. They're looking at the spinous process, okay? This is also in your books in chapter 4. In addition to the vertebral body here and here on this side, you have the vertebral foramina, or foramen, that hole. And in that hole is where the spinal cord actually passes through and is protected and housed. And then you have the vertebral arch, okay, the vertebral arch. So this is cervical. And this is what we classify, that I talked about in another lecture, is your irregular bones. I think I forgot to talk about it in the skull lecture, but the skull bones tend to be the flat bones, okay? Thin and expanded, irregular is vertebral bones. So moving on from the cervical bone, we then hit the thoracic, okay? So the neck then comes into contact with the thoracic, and the thoracic is where we're going to be housing the lungs and the heart. And this is also going to be where the distance between the vertebrae and the spinal column is furthest away from the top of the tissue. Hence, we have this very, very nice long spinous process, okay? Now, the wings in this one are very, very truncated and short, okay? And this is how it actually lays in the animal's back, all right? You'll have the vertebral body here. You'll have your spinous transverse process here, spinous process here, vertebral body, vertebral foramina, and then the vertebral arch. Okay? So thoracic has a very truncated transverse process, very long spinous process. Once we move from the thoracic cavity, and also we have the articulation with the ribs, okay, which I'll show that later. That's also considered, the rib is a flat bone. From the thoracic cavity, we're then moving into the lumbar region. Okay, this is going to be the area that is going to have all the abdominal guts, so the stomach, the intestines are all going to be housed under this region of the animal's body. Now you'll notice in the lumbar region that we have transverse processes that are very long. So opposite of the thoracic, where we have the transverse processes, they really look like an airplane coming out, and they have a much shorter spinous process. Okay, a much shorter spinous process. And then they also have the vertebral body, the vertebral foramina, and the vertebral arch. And I'll turn this around so you can see that on this end. Body, foramina, arch. So the lumbar. Then the lumbar vertebrae articulates with the sacrum. This is going to be the region where we have the pelvic girdle of the animal, where when those of you who took artificial insemination, you come in and palpate the animal. Notice that this sacrum is fused, so it articulates with the lumbar vertebrae, but all of these vertebrae are fused. So we have the spinous process and all of the transverse process. The older the animal gets, the more bone that's deposited. Okay, so the sacrum fuses. In the young animal, we have spaces in between it, but it's not long after they hit around the pubertal stage of development that this all begins to fill in. And then we have the tail region. I always think of this as this is the caudal vertebrae. You might see it also as coccygeal vertebrae. Spinous process and the transverse process. I think that looks like a spaceship. Spaceship from the movie Independence Day. Okay. And again, the vertebral foramina, the body, and the arch. And those are all of the vertebrae that you need to know.